Medieval China was not a single world, frozen in time. It was a long succession of dynasties, collapses, recoveries, and reinventions. Beneath the surface of silk, philosophy, and imperial order existed a society shaped by discipline, fear, and endurance. To understand medieval China, one must look past emperors and inventions and into the lives of ordinary people who carried the weight of the system. For most, life revolved around the land. Agriculture was the foundation of survival and the backbone of the state. Rice paddies in the south and wheat fields in the north demanded relentless labor. Floods, droughts, and famine were constant threats. When the harvest failed, starvation followed quickly. The state recorded grain, not happiness. The imperial system promised harmony, but it depended on strict hierarchy. At the top stood the emperor, believed to rule by the mandate of heaven. His authority was absolute but conditional. Natural disasters, rebellions, or economic collapse were seen as signs that heaven had withdrawn its favor. When that belief took hold, dynasties fell violently. Below the emperor were scholar officials, selected through examinations that tested knowledge of Confucian texts. In theory, this allowed talent to rise above birth. In reality, education required wealth and time. Power remained concentrated among elites who understood the rules of the system and benefited from them. Confucianism shaped every relationship: father over son, husband over wife, ruler over subject. Obedience was virtue, stability was moral good, individual desire was dangerous. Society was designed to suppress chaos, even at the cost of personal freedom. For peasants, this philosophy translated into duty without voice. Taxes were heavy. Labor service was mandatory. Men were conscripted to build roads, canals, and walls. Absence from the fields meant hunger at home. Resistance was punished swiftly. Women lived under rigid expectations. A woman was expected to obey her father, then her husband, then her son. Marriage was arranged. Divorce favored men. Female virtue was measured in silence, loyalty, and endurance. Foot binding, emerging during later medieval periods, turned control into physical pain, reshaping bodies to match ideals of submission. Cities offered opportunity, but also danger. Medieval Chinese cities were large, crowded, and tightly regulated. Curfews controlled movement. Gates closed at night. Markets were supervised. Order was enforced through surveillance and punishment. Crime existed, but it was rarely romantic. Punishment in medieval China was systematic and public. Beatings, exile, forced labor, and execution were tools of governance. Law was not meant to protect individuals equally. It existed to preserve order. Confession was often extracted through pain. Justice prioritized stability over truth. Despite this, the state was remarkably efficient. Bureaucracy recorded households, land, and labor. Canals moved grain across vast distances. The Grand Canal connected north and south, feeding capitals and armies. Infrastructure held the empire together even as dynasties changed. War was constant. Borders shifted. Nomadic invasions from the north forced militarization. Soldiers were drawn from peasant populations already stretched thin. Victory brought temporary relief. Defeat brought massacres, displacement, and forced migration. Religion offered limited escape. Buddhism spread widely, offering solace and monastic refuge. Taoism promised harmony with nature, yet neither challenged imperial authority directly. Spiritual life coexisted with political control, rarely opposing it. Rebellions erupted when pressure became unbearable. Peasant uprisings were frequent and devastating. Leaders claimed heaven's mandate. Millions died in cycles of collapse and restoration. Each new dynasty promised renewal. Each eventually repeated the same patterns. Family was the last refuge. Kinship networks provided support the state did not. Ancestor worship reinforced loyalty across generations. The dead were as important as the living. Memory anchored identity in a world where the future was uncertain. Education was revered, but inaccessible. For those who passed examinations, power awaited. For those who failed, bitterness followed. The exam system created hope and despair in equal measure. Success was rare. Failure was common. Medieval China was not peaceful. It was managed. Stability was achieved through pressure, discipline, and the constant threat of collapse. Order existed because chaos was never far away. The brilliance of medieval China lies not only in its inventions or philosophy, but in its endurance. A civilization repeatedly broken, yet always rebuilt, at immense human cost. This was the surface of medieval China. Beneath it lay deeper tensions, harsher realities, and lives lived under constant awareness that harmony was fragile, and survival was never guaranteed. To understand that deeper world, one must move closer, into homes, fields, courts, and punishments, into the quiet spaces where ordinary people learned how to endure an empire that demanded everything from them. And that is where the true story begins. Beyond the grand theories of harmony and order, daily life in medieval China was shaped by pressure applied quietly and constantly. The empire did not need to terrorize openly at all times. It relied on routine, expectation, and the knowledge that punishment was never far away. The household was the primary unit of control. Every family was registered. Names, ages, land, and obligations were recorded. To exist outside this system was to invite suspicion. The state did not need to watch everyone directly. Families watched themselves. Fathers carried legal authority over their households. Their duty was not only to provide, but to enforce moral behavior. If a son disobeyed, the father was blamed. If a wife caused disorder, the husband answered for it. Responsibility flowed upward, punishment downward. This structure made obedience self-sustaining. Shame was as powerful as fear. Public reputation mattered deeply. To be labeled unfilial or disorderly was to lose social standing, opportunity, and protection. Isolation could be fatal. Women lived within the narrowest boundaries. Marriage removed them from their birth families and placed them under total authority of their husband's household. A woman's value lay in producing sons and maintaining harmony. Emotional suffering was irrelevant. Silence was praised. Foot binding, emerging and spreading during later medieval periods, turned obedience into permanence. The practice limited movement, enforced dependence, and transformed pain into virtue. It was not imposed by the state, but by society itself. Control no longer needed law. Children learned hierarchy early. Education emphasized memorization, obedience, and moral conformity. Creativity was secondary. Questioning authority was dangerous. The ideal citizen was predictable, disciplined, and loyal. For peasants, taxes were relentless. Grain, cloth, and labor were extracted with little regard for harvest conditions. Failure to pay led to beatings, imprisonment, or forced labor. Families sold possessions, land, even children to survive. Slavery, though regulated, existed as a last resort. Corruption was widespread. Local officials abused power, altered records, and extorted bribes. Complaints traveled slowly upward, often disappearing before reaching anyone who could act. Justice was theoretical. Survival was practical. Punishment was designed to be instructive. Whipping, caning, tattooing, and exile marked bodies permanently. Execution was public. The goal was not rehabilitation, but deterrence. A punished body carried a message to everyone watching. Exile was sometimes worse than death. To be sent to distant frontiers meant separation from family, loss of identity, and exposure to disease and violence. Many never returned. The empire expanded not only through conquest, but through the disposal of unwanted lives. Military life offered little relief. Soldiers were poorly paid and harshly disciplined. Desertion was punished severely. Campaigns were brutal and prolonged. Victory brought prestige to commanders, not comfort to those who fought. Nomadic threats from the north haunted every dynasty. Walls were built, expanded, and rebuilt. Fortifications symbolized both strength and fear. Defense consumed enormous resources. Peasants paid the price. Cities reflected imperial order in stone and wood. Streets were planned. Markets were regulated. Night curfews enforced silence. Gates closed. The city slept by command. Freedom of movement was a privilege, not a right. Yet within cities, inequality was visible. Merchants accumulated wealth but lacked status. Scholars held prestige but depended on state favor. Artisans worked constantly, respected for skill but easily replaced. Everyone knew their place. Entertainment existed, but it was controlled. Theater, storytelling, and festivals reinforced moral lessons. Even pleasure carried instruction. Excess was frowned upon. Moderation was virtue. Religion offered moments of escape. Buddhist monasteries provided refuge for some, especially women seeking to avoid marriage, but monasteries were taxed, regulated, and periodically suppressed when they grew too powerful. No institution was allowed to rival the state. Taoist practices promised harmony with nature but not rebellion. Spiritual withdrawal was tolerated as long as it remained private. The empire feared mass movements. History had taught it the cost of unchecked belief. When rebellion came, it was catastrophic. Entire regions rose in desperation. Armies marched. Cities burned. Millions died. Rebellions were remembered not as resistance, but as disasters. Order was restored through overwhelming force. Each collapse followed a familiar pattern. Corruption spread. Taxes increased. Famine weakened the population. Rebellion erupted. A new dynasty claimed heaven's mandate. Promises were made. The cycle resumed. Ordinary people adapted by narrowing their expectations. Hope was dangerous. Endurance was safer. Survival depended on flexibility, silence, and loyalty to family above all else. This was medieval China's strength and its tragedy. A civilization capable of remarkable coordination, sustained by systems that demanded obedience at every level. Harmony was not natural. It was enforced. Yet within this rigidity, human life continued. People loved their children. They mourned their dead. They found meaning in ritual, memory, and routine. These quiet acts were not celebrated by history, but they carried civilization forward. The empire did not survive because it was gentle. It survived because it was resilient, adaptive, and willing to sacrifice countless lives to preserve order. To understand medieval China fully, one must abandon the idea of peace as comfort. Peace meant stability. Stability meant control. And control always had a price. The brilliance of the system lay in its invisibility. Most of the time, force did not need to be shown. Everyone already knew where it waited. And so life continued. Fields were planted. Taxes were collected. Children grew. Dynasties rose and fell. The structure endured. But beneath this endurance was tension, constant and unresolved. A civilization balanced between harmony and collapse, surviving not through kindness, but through discipline. And it was this tension, not philosophy or invention, that defined medieval China. To see it clearly, one must look not at emperors or monuments, but at the lives quietly shaped, limited, and consumed by the machinery of order. That is where the final understanding waits. In the final centuries of medieval China, the weight of order pressed hardest on those least able to resist it. The system endured, but endurance did not mean peace. It meant containment. The empire survived by narrowing the space in which life could move. As populations grew, pressure intensified. Land was divided again and again until plots became too small to sustain families. Debt followed. Tenant farming replaced ownership. Peasants worked land they no longer controlled, paying rent, taxes, and labor service from shrinking harvests. Survival became arithmetic. Many failed the calculation. Migration increased. People drifted towards cities, canals, and borders, seeking opportunity or escape. The state viewed movement with suspicion. Stability depended on knowing where people belonged. Unregistered lives were dangerous. Wanderers were treated as criminals by default. Banditry rose in times of strain. Gangs formed in mountains, forests, and riverlands. Like elsewhere in the medieval world, crime was a symptom, not a cause. The state responded with force, not reform. Campaigns against bandits were brutal. Villages suspected of cooperation were punished collectively. Order was restored through fear. Natural disasters exposed the limits of imperial control. Floods along the Yellow River destroyed entire regions. Dikes failed. Famine followed. Relief existed on paper, but corruption swallowed much of it. When starvation spread, rebellion followed close behind. These uprisings were not driven by ideology, but desperation. Leaders claimed heaven's mandate because it was the only language power understood. Once rebellion reached a certain scale, compromise vanished. Suppression became annihilation. Mass death was not an accident of these conflicts. It was accepted as necessary. The empire calculated survival in terms of stability, not lives. If millions died but order returned, the system was considered successful. After each collapse, reconstruction began. New rulers promised moral renewal. Taxes were reduced temporarily. Corrupt officials were punished publicly. Hope returned cautiously. Then the cycle resumed. Memory was short. Pressure rebuilt. The examination system, often praised as meritocratic, became another instrument of control. It defined success narrowly. Classical knowledge mattered more than innovation. Those who failed repeatedly carried lifelong shame. The system rewarded conformity and punished divergence. Art and culture flourished within boundaries. Poetry expressed longing indirectly. Paintings celebrated nature, not society. Beauty existed, but it avoided confrontation. Creativity learned to survive by restraint. Foreign contact increased during later medieval periods. Trade routes expanded. New ideas entered the empire. Yet the core structure resisted change. External influence was filtered, controlled, and reshaped to fit existing hierarchies. The family remained the empire's most reliable pillar. Loyalty to kin outweighed loyalty to state when crisis struck. Officials understood this and exploited it. Collective punishment ensured families disciplined their own. Love became enforcement. Death was omnipresent. Ancestor worship provided continuity in a world of instability. The dead offered guidance where the future did not. Rituals anchored meaning when life felt expendable. For women, life rarely improved. Foot binding spread further, tightening social expectations. Stories praised female sacrifice, chastity, and obedience. Widowhood was idealized. Suicide after a husband's death was sometimes celebrated as virtue. Control reached its most intimate form. Yet even here, resistance existed. Quiet, personal, and rarely recorded. A woman refusing remarriage. A family hiding grain. A scholar writing cautiously critical poetry. These acts did not change the system, but they preserved dignity. Medieval China's greatest achievement was not invention or administration alone. It was continuity. A civilization repeatedly broken and reassembled, always returning to the same principles. Hierarchy, discipline, order. This continuity came at immense cost. Lives were consumed to maintain balance. Suffering was normalized. Harmony was defined as absence of rebellion, not presence of well-being. To modern eyes, this world can appear stable, even advanced. But stability built on pressure is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant sacrifice. Medieval China did not sleep easily. It watched itself carefully. It recorded, regulated, and corrected. The empire survived because it never trusted comfort. And yet, within this machine, people lived full emotional lives. They loved children, mourned parents, celebrated festivals, and told stories. Humanity persisted not because the system allowed it, but because it could not be erased. This is the final truth of medieval China. A civilization of extraordinary resilience, sustained by control, fear, and discipline, yet animated by ordinary human endurance. Not peaceful, not cruel without reason, but uncompromising in its demand for order. To understand it is not to judge it by modern standards, but to recognize the price it paid to exist at all. Medieval China was not a golden age. It was an age of balance, constantly negotiated, constantly threatened, and beneath every pagoda, every canal, every law, lived the same quiet understanding shared by generations. Survival came first. Everything else was secondary.